So now we've talked about pre-Columbian America, we've talked about Europe on the eve of the Columbian Exchange, as well as a little bit of West Africa. Now let's actually get to the Columbian Exchange itself. Let's actually have Christopher Columbus cross the Atlantic in the year 1492. Now, a little bit about Columbus. Obviously, Columbus is one of those figures whose reputation has gone through a lot of reassessment over the last few years and decades. Probably the best way I could introduce Columbus, though, is to talk about a figure that we see a lot of in history, if we're honest. And that is that in history, sometimes the people who can make the most impact are the stupid smart people. Um, a little bit on stupid smart people, because I understand that's a contradiction in terms. So, stupid smart people are people who are smart maybe in a particular area. Like they do have a fantastic degree of competence in something, but they're woefully inadequate in other areas. Case in point, Wile E. Coyote here. I'm kicking it old school, which is maybe appropriate for a history class. Wile E. Coyote here is devising new ways of, I suppose, catching the Roadrunner, but maybe not being so good at actually using those inventions. Wile E. Coyote is a classic example of a stupid smart person. Um, Now, Columbus is an example of a stupid smart person because, on the one hand, Columbus was actually a very, very good sailor. And he was also a very decent navigator up to a point. For those of you who don't know, Christopher Columbus was actually a Genoese merchant. Genoa, by the way, is basically an independent city-state in Italy. And he actually starts working for the Spanish crown. The Spanish are kind of interested in sort of exploring overseas trade, like the Portuguese, and Columbus comes to King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella with an offer that they can't refuse. He comes to them and offers them the riches of East Asia if they will fund his expedition. And as you guys know, they do, but the reason that Columbus thinks he can make it all the way to East Asia is because, well, this is where the stupid part comes in, right? So he's good at managing a ship, like the day-to-day business of, operating a vessel. But Columbus tragically underestimates how big planet Earth actually is. So, case in point, when he meanders his way through the Caribbean right here and arrives in Cuba, he actually thinks that Cuba is really Japan. And by the way, it's not as if he goes, oh, well, there are palm trees here. I don't really seem to remember palm trees being associated with Japan, or this doesn't look much like Japan, so I guess it's someplace else. No, he thinks it's Japan. He thinks it's Japan on his first trip. He thinks it's Japan on his second trip. He makes 4 trips to the New World, and to his dying day, he still believes that he has discovered a passage to Asia. It's also worth noting that one of the reasons we call America America instead of Columbia is because Columbus was an idiot. That sounds harsh. I guess it kind of is. But the thing is that if Columbus, if Columbus was ever asked, hey, what do you think we should call this new landmass you've discovered? Columbus would just retort, I haven't discovered a new landmass. This is Japan, right? So what happens is that this new landmass is named for Italian cartographer, basically means map maker, Amerigo Vespucci. Amerigo becomes America. But Columbus, to his dying day, still thinks he's found the passage to Asia. Now, obviously, one of the other things that happens, and we'll sort of talk about this a little bit more, is that when he arrives, in Cuba, in Hispaniola. He kind of, travels all around the Caribbean, actually. One of the things he notes is that the native there, called the Taino people, are very hospitable, very welcoming, and Columbus sets about doing two things. One is he tries to convert them to Christianity. The other thing is he enslaves a lot of them and works them to death in his drive to find gold, or at least something of valuable, in the land that he's discovered. More on that a little bit later. Now, um, that being said, let's say that Columbus's benefactors, um, King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella, let's say they were less stubborn than Columbus. They obviously knew that Columbus had not actually reached East Asia. He had found something different. So, go Team Spain, right? Spain has managed to find a new continent. And in fact, not just one new continent, but eventually two new continents, right? Because North and South America are kind of a package deal. They should be happy about it, right? Well, not exactly. Not exactly, because remember, the goal was to find a sea route to Asia, and they don't find it. In fact, the mood in at least the Spanish court was kind of despondent. Like, they are grieving over the fact that they've discovered, a new continent, and partially that's because, you know, they don't know this immediately, because obviously Columbus really just finds islands in the Caribbean Sea, right? He discovers, the Lesser Antilles. He discovers Cuba. He discovers what is now Haiti and the Dominican Republic. They're not necessarily aware of the fact that you actually have this landmass that goes all the way from the Arctic Circle to practically Antarctica, and it's a contiguous landmass. But eventually, through subsequent, exploration missions, they do discover that basically the North and South American continents are basically big natural speed bumps that separate the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. And whenever that's discovered, again, the atmosphere is one of despondency. They, just kind of makes us feel good about ourselves, right? The fact that when the future territory that encompasses the United States is discovered by Europeans, the Europeans despair over that fact. And to be honest, that's not the last moment or the last instance will sort of disappoint our European colonizers. But that being said, the European powers, Spain specifically, try to make the best of it. And also, what's important to remember is that because Spain and Portugal are the two early European nations to go out and colonize, they basically claim all of North America and South America for themselves. Eventually, they kind of get into a spat over who exactly owns what. The Pope sits down with them and has couples counseling, basically, and the result is basically they agree to split it to a certain extent. But when the Europeans decide to make the best of it, they decide that they're going to try to find three G's. And I'm sure a lot of you have already heard of those three G's, right? God, gold, and glory. For those of you who don't know, God being the opportunity to convert potentially millions of people to specifically Catholic Christianity, because remember, this is before the Protestant Reformation. But to find, or at least to export Catholic Christianity to the New World, to find a buttload of gold, and finally to, win some bragging rights. And by the way, this whole idea of glory, let me go ahead and kind of describe what that is. A lot of the people who traveled to the New World originally are not necessarily from well-connected, politically powerful families. If you are a noble in Spain, if you're a lord or a baron or something, why the heck would you want to move to the American colonies, right? There's really not much for you. There's a whole lot of risk without much reward. But one of the attractions of, let's say, colonization for people is that it allowed people of meager birth but exceptional abilities to prove themselves. And, we already have, it's almost like we're touching on something that you've probably already heard before. I'll give you just a second to kind of think what that could be. It's almost like we're talking about the American dream. The idea that if you work hard and if you're intelligent, then you can kind of rise above your background. And by the way, I'm not here to tell you if you should or shouldn't believe in the American dream. As a historian, that's not really my job. Like, that's a philosophy department thing, practically. But what I am here to tell you is that this idea that the American colonies are kind of like an opportunity for people to rise above their birth, where they start, that is real. And that is something that attracts very different types of people to the New World. Not just during this time period, but really, I mean, that's something that's kind of always been the case. But again, you have very different types of characters who decide to take advantage of that. So, for example, really the classic example here would be people like Columbus. Or if Columbus seems too dumb for you, and to be honest, he kind of is, somebody like the Spanish conquistador Hernando Cortez, who we'll talk a little bit about in just a few minutes. Somebody who is actually exceptionally intelligent, but he's also basically a sociopath. Those people, for whatever reason, tend to do very well in the American colonies. But you have people like Cortez. You also have scientists in the 19th century like Nikola Tesla, right? A very different kind of character, but somebody else who manages to kind of, let's say, pursue opportunities that weren't really available for him in Europe. So we already have this discussion on, maybe not the American dream exactly, because we don't have the United States yet, but the idea that moving to the New World is a chance to start over and a chance to kind of, let's say, go above where you could go back home in Europe. So, they're trying to find God, gold, and glory. Now, the thing is that they actually succeed. The Spanish especially, and for the Spanish specifically, they kind of combine gold and glory together. And so when the Spanish managed to conquer the Aztec and Incan empires, they basically force the Aztec and Inca leadership to provide the conquistadors with as much gold as they possibly can. So they do actually find large quantities of gold. And, the thing is that it's not as if they can pocket all of that. I'm sure they would like to. But remember that the New World was claimed by the Spanish crown, which meant that depending on who was actually, king of or queen of Spain at the time, it meant that basically anything that the conquistadors found was the property of the Spanish crown. And so what happened is that all of this gold and silver, all of these valuables, they were just loaded up on these big treasure ships. And ever so often, they would send treasure fleets from, usually they would sort of set sail from the Mexican port city of Veracruz, and they would basically travel all the way back to Spain. Now, the thing is that if you are an entrepreneurial sort, or let's say that you really like the Pirates of the Caribbean series, you might think that a good way to make an easy buck is to actually raid some of those treasure fleets. So if you've ever heard of the expression or of the phrase "the Spanish Main," that usually comes up in pirate films. Yar, the Spanish Main. Sorry that you guys had to endure that, but that's a reference to the fact that other Europeans were starting to get interested in the New World, not necessarily for purposes of colonization, but because they realized that the Spanish had done a lot of hard work getting all of that gold. It would be a shame if something happened to it. And so some of the earliest, pirates basically were a result of European powers trying to kind of take advantage of the successes that the Spanish enjoyed. Um, by the way, this is just a little bit of, I guess, not really foreshadowing, but a little bit of context. So, North Carolina has a special moment in the story of colonization, right? Um, we have the lost colony. Still haven't really gotten around to finding it yet. This colony that's basically set up along the Outer Banks. And if you think about it, the idea of setting up a colony in the middle of a bunch of sandbars sounds real, real stupid. And it is real, real stupid. But that's kind of the point, because those sandbars allow English ships and privateers the ability to set sail from the east coast of the United States, go all the way down to the Caribbean, steal a Spanish treasure ship or two or three, and then make bank. That's the idea. So, in other words, you can kind of get a sense that that Spain's early successes in colonization are going to have some major ripple effects throughout Europe. And speaking of those ripple effects, one of the things, or one of the lessons of colonization, is that there is such a thing as too much of a good thing. So, in finding all of this gold and silver, um, the problem is well, it's this. We're actually going to talk a fair amount about inflation in this course. Sorry. I'll just go ahead and say that of all the history courses that you take, U.S. history is the most, let's say, it places the most emphasis on economics. You don't have to like it, by the way. I've kind of learned to adapt to it, but it is what it is. Fortunately, you don't have to know that much about economics. You just kind of have to know the general concepts. So go ahead and underline this, star this, do whatever you have to do to remember the concept of inflation. So I'm going to ask you guys a super annoying but super important question. What is money? Theoretically, money is a system or like a symbol of value, right? It represents something that is valuable. And theoretically, money is supposed to represent goods and services in the economy, right? So if money is supposed to reflect something that's valuable, then theoretically, the more goods that are made, the more services that are provided, the more your economy grows, the more the money supply should grow. In other words, the total amount of money circulating through the economy. Nowadays, it's really easy to change the money supply. I mean, we use paper currency, right? We have mints that can basically print as much paper currency as we really want. And so it's really easy to increase or decrease the amount of money circulating in the economy. Now, the thing is that for most of human history, from the time of the Lydians, if Mr. Habib went over the Lydians, back in Anatolia, in ancient world history, from the time of the Lydians up until this point, money really isn't paper. Money has always been based around precious metals, gold, silver, usually. And one of the reasons for that is that if you think about gold and silver, um, gold and silver really aren't all that useful. They're precious, shiny metals, but gold is actually very soft and malleable. So it's not like you can make it a spear and stab somebody with it. You can make jewelry out of it, but I mean, it can't be used for tools. It can't be used for weapons. So really, the only thing it can be used for is for jewelry and for money. And the nice thing about gold and silver, to a certain extent, is that both metals are very, very scarce. I don't know if this is accurate, but I heard at one point a scientist say that you could probably fill all the world's gold in one Olympic-sized swimming pool. Now, I mean, that's still a lot, but if you think about it, it's really not. Now, that could be wrong. It sounds wrong to me, but that does reflect how scarce gold and even silver actually are. So what that means is that um, because these metals are so scarce, you don't have to worry about inflation. Inflation, by the way, is what happens if there is too much money and too few goods. Because what happens is that if you're just pumping a lot of money into the economy, right? Let's say that um, you, if money is a reflection of the goods in the economy, and let's say that in 1 year you double the amount of money in the money supply, right? Well, what that means is that if I'm selling you a hamburger for $1, kind of sounds sketchy, doesn't it? Then that means that unless I change prices, my hamburger is half as valuable as it used to be. So I'm going to have to increase prices because there's just more money in the money supply. So the effect is that inflation can sometimes be very, very dangerous, actually, to an economy. It has the effect of raising prices across the board. And it's especially hard on poor people who typically it's hard, especially on poorer people who have to buy products to meet their basic needs, and maybe they just don't have a lot of cash handy for whatever reason. Now, that's something that we're going to talk a lot about in this course. We mention inflation quite a bit. So if you don't understand it now, that's okay, because we're going to be talking about it a lot. But just for now, um, understand that inflation is what happens when you have too much money circulating in the economy and prices start to spike, start to increase. Now, again, gold and silver um, means that the money supply is self-regulating, right? I mean, you can't print more gold. You've got to mine the stuff. So in most cases in human history, or most instances in human history, um, it means that you don't have to worry about inflation, except with the Columbian Exchange. Suddenly, there's a whole heck of a lot of gold and silver going back to Europe and all throughout Europe. Within just really a small time period, 100 years, you can see this massive increase in prices. By 1650, it looks like there's been a 500% increase in prices, and that's extraordinary. Now, that being said, in the Columbian Exchange, that's not the only thing going on. Or that's not the only thing being exchanged. The thing is that the Americas and Europe have been separated for thousands of years, and so you have certain crops and certain products that are native to North America and South America that are transported to Europe. So I'd like to go over a couple of these just right quick. Obviously, we mentioned that silver and gold was found in large quantities in the Americas. What's important to know, by the way, is that it's not as if you could just find silver and gold everywhere. You find, or let's say the conquistadors found silver and gold in a few specific locations. But it's almost as if Europeans didn't listen very well, because a lot of the enthusiasm for migrating from Europe to the New World was based on the idea that anybody could find gold. And you get these almost hilarious, almost tragic scenes of European explorers in the next few decades and centuries, just assuming that gold and silver are going to be found everywhere. More on that over the next few lessons, actually. But you have crops like potatoes, sweet potatoes, vanilla, chocolate, wild rice, and tomatoes. Yes, there's at least one of you, maybe it's you, 3 a.m., who is just wondering, man, how could you live without chocolate? Well, Europeans did for thousands of years, apparently. Also, imagine Italian food without tomatoes. That Italian cuisine has existed longer without tomatoes than with tomatoes. But the big one that we're going to talk about is tobacco. Tobacco is going to be one of those cash crops. And for the first English colonies, that is ultimately what will convince the English to build permanent colonies in the New World, albeit they were a little reluctant about it. Now, that being said, let's talk about what Europeans bring to the New World. Now, also, let me go ahead and get the title down on the slide. Boom, the Columbian Exchange. It even has a lovely sound effect. So, probably, I mean, to be honest, these are going to be a lot more significant, and you'll kind of see why in just a second. So the first thing is Christianity. In a very short period of time, the vast majority of Native Americans, at least in Mexico, Central America, and South America, are converted to Catholic Christianity, because the Spanish and to a certain extent the Portuguese really prioritize that, and that's actually going to be very central to how they run their colonies, and we'll sort of contrast that with the English system in just a second. The English and really the other European powers weren't as keen on converting Native Americans to Christianity for a variety of reasons. You have the transportation, maybe not of iron, but at least of iron tools. It should be noted that one of the reasons why the Europeans were able to defeat empires like the Aztec and Inca, I mean, to a certain extent, people think that it's because of guns. But to be honest, most firearms during that time period were crap. You could probably hit a target from maybe half a football field away, and then it took you 1 minute to reload. So, in other words, you really just hope that your target would just stay in one place for a minute. But if they didn't, well, you were going to have your work cut out for you. So it was actually not gunpowder weapons per se that was the game changer. It was the fact that the Spanish brought iron weapons and iron armor. In contrast, the Aztec had like stone weapons, stone swords, very brittle, and to be honest, they just didn't have any impact at all on Spanish armor. So a few other things, sailing ships and wheeled vehicles. Wheeled vehicles especially, I mean, one of the things you kind of see is that all cultures are kind of different. Interestingly, even though the Aztec and the Maya and the Inca were incredibly advanced in mathematics and astronomy, they never invented the wheel. So wheeled vehicles was a game changer, but maybe the reason you don't really have a wheeled vehicle is because you don't have these. Horses, as far as we know, evolved in North America, but they migrated out of North America. And so the Europeans are reintroducing them. For certain Native American tribes, especially in the Great Plains of the United States, this is going to be a game changer. And I'll kind of explain why. So if you're a hunter-gatherer society, it means you're traveling to find, um, the herds, or you're following the herds, right? That's what hunting involves. But you can understand that hunting on horseback is super nice. It means that you don't have to be Usain Bolt, for example, to be a successful hunter of bison on the Great Plains. You don't have to, be a marathon runner. In other words, all you need is you need a horse that's domesticated. So, whereas let's just say that the Columbian Exchange was kind of a bad bargain for Native Americans, if there was a winner in the Columbian Exchange, it was probably the Great Plains Indians. But speaking of, losing the Columbian Exchange, probably the most dramatic impact of all is the fact that the Spanish bring diseases that Native Americans had just not ever been exposed to, especially smallpox, by the way. So what happens is that with the introduction of smallpox to a population without immunity whatsoever, it means that over 90% of the Native American population in both North and South America is lost within the span of 100 years. Um, Part of that is probably because of the results of war and exploitation by Europeans. I mean, that is definitely a thing, but just to be honest, European warfare doesn't hold a candle to microbial warfare, and the fact that these diseases just ravage entire populations without any acquired immunity basically destroys them. So that being said, Europeans do introduce new food crops like watermelon, peaches, but also what's kind of noteworthy is the fact that even though gunpowder weapons during this time period are terrible, they won't stay terrible. And Native Americans will slowly but surely acquire these gunpowder based weapons. And by the way, because they come from hunter-gatherer societies, they're actually very, very good at using them. They actually tended to make much better hunters and warriors and shots than a lot of the city-dwelling Europeans who were very often shipped to the New World. But, and here's the but, you would think that these firearms would give Native Americans protection from Europeans, and that's not actually the case. Europeans actually make Native Americans dependent on firearms during certain time periods because the problem with firearms is that you don't just need a gun, you also need what else? Ammunition. And Native Americans don't have forges available to really make standardized ammunition for these gunpowder weapons. So what you're going to see during this course is there will be several Native American wars in which Native Americans rise up and kick some serious European butt to a certain extent. Like they win the battles and then they run out of ammo. And then that's when they start losing. So gunpowder weapons are kind of a mixed blessing. It makes them more powerful, but at the same time, it makes them very dependent. So the fact that you have this outbreak of disease that just wipes out a huge proportion of the native population is a tragedy. So if you look, for example, at the Taino people of Hispaniola. This is one of the places that Columbus visited on his first journey, actually. the Taino people in Hispaniola, as far as we know, numbered about 300,000 people during the year 1492, which, is a considerable number of people. Then by 1510, so we're talking about less than 20 years later, you go from 300,000 down to 33,000. And then by 1548, about, a little less than 40 years later, you go from 33,000 down to 500. So for some tribes, for some groups, you're talking about the virtual extinction of an entire group of people. So the Taino are kind of an extreme example, but that's what the Columbian Exchange looked like for many Native Americans. And it wasn't just disease, of course. It's the fact that, it's kind of hard to fight disease and worry about your health if you're also treated, and actually are, an enslaved laborer, which is also something that Columbus did. So what happens is that the Spanish and the Portuguese face a problem. The problem for them is not the fact that millions of people are dying and they're up at night worrying about the consequences. Well, some are, but certainly not all of them are. The problem is that Spanish and Portuguese colonial authorities expected that they could use Native Americans as cheap, exploitable labor. And this idea has a name. It's called the encomienda system. For those of you who are familiar with the idea of feudalism, basically the encomienda system was supposed to be a copy-pasted version of feudalism brought to the New World. So the idea for the Spanish is that the Spanish would convert Native Americans to Christianity, they would take care of them, provide for their basic necessities, and that's kind of the way that feudalism was supposed to work, right? The feudal lord expected a lot of you, but the feudal lord was also supposed to protect you. That's how it's supposed to work in theory. There's going to be an assignment that you have where you get to see how it actually works in practice, where in many cases the Spanish just use them as cheap labor, and basically Native Americans are worked to death. Now, what also happens is that you have these large estates called haciendas that are given to Spanish officials, Spanish elites, through grants called encomenderas, hence the term encomienda system. So what starts to happen is that for many Europeans, or for many Spaniards at this point, they realize that if you come from a middle class background, you could actually become almost like a part of the nobility in the New World. So if you're interested, go ahead and pause it here and take down the definition of the encomienda system. This isn't going to be the last time you see this, by the way. And it's also where we can kind of see the beginnings of cash crop style agriculture, where many of these haciendas will grow things like tobacco and indigo, and crops that can be sold for profit. So as Europeans, and specifically the Spaniards and Portuguese explorers and conquistadors and soldiers and administrators start moving to the New World, you see this kind of unique hierarchy develop. You know how we mentioned that the encomienda system was kind of like it's similar in feudalism. You almost kind of have this feudal social hierarchy that develops. Now, the way it works is that you have peninsulares at the very top. This is a term that's used to refer to people who were actually born in Spain. So, for example, when Cortez overthrows the Aztec Empire, basically Mexico, or before Mexico was Mexico, it was called New Spain. And New Spain had a viceroy. And the viceroy of New Spain was one of the most powerful individuals on the planet, because Mexico was a pretty substantial country today, and New Spain was certainly a substantial colonial province. So the viceroy of New Spain would be considered a peninsulare. And so he would be at the very top. But then you also have um, people who are born in the colonies to Spanish parents, but because you're born in the colonies, you're kind of looked at as almost like a hick, like you're a yokel. You're from the backwater, and so many of these people from the criollas class, sometimes they're called Creoles. Tomato, tomato. I'm not an authority on Spanish or Portuguese. But members of this Creole class, whenever they would return to Spain, they were always treated as second class citizens. So, in other words, you might be hot stuff in the colonies. You might be a general, you might be a high ranking bureaucrat, but once you hop on board a ship and go to Spain, well, you're just like everybody else. And that creates a certain degree of resentment between the Peninsulares and the Creoles, where the Creoles are kind of going, well, what do they have that I don't? Now, at this point, though, we start to talk about not only country of origin, but race. Obviously, we talked about the introduction of slavery yesterday, and so our discussion of race is just going to continue in this course throughout. But it's important to note that let's say race plays a very different role throughout Spain and Portugal's colonies than it does in the United States, or what will become the United States. So, what happens is that usually when colonies are first established, colonies tend to attract young single guys who are trying to make a living for themselves. Now, the thing is that very often these young single guys could be stuck in the colonies for a long time. I should point out, by the way, that very few European colonies were planned to be long-term colonies. Almost all of them were meant to be short-term, um, you know, um, short-term habitations. But what happens is that when some of these Spanish immigrants whenever they realize that they're going to be here for a while, many of them start developing relationships or intermarrying with Native Americans, and this forms the mestizo population, this population of Spanish and Native American people who have intermarried and intermixed. And it's worth noting, by the way, that if you're looking at Latin America today, there might be a few exceptions here, but if you look at, for example, Mexico, the vast majority of Mexicans today are descended from the mestizo population. And the thing is that while marrying Native Americans was something that kind of raised eyebrows, at the same time it wasn't prohibited because, again, the idea is that Native Americans were supposed to be Christianized. They were supposed to be converted to Christianity. And so there was almost like this perception that, um, you know, everybody is equal under the eyes of God. That being said, it didn't stop the Europeans from mistreating those Native Americans, right? But in other words, if you were a Native American in Spain's colonies, I'm not going to say that it was necessarily a great experience for you, but at least you had a decent chance of not always being treated like a second-class citizen, which would be the case in with England's colonies that we'll talk about. Um, so you have the mestizos, you have Native American Indians, kind of that form sort of like this class right underneath. And then finally, the lowest group on the totem pole, you have enslaved African Americans, or at this point, we can just say enslaved Africans who are brought by the Middle Passage. We'll talk again a little bit more about them. But, the fact that you have this friction between the Creole population and the Peninsulares, this comes up time and time again. It's not going to come up right now, but there's this resentment that develops between Europeans who move to the colonies and spend their lives there, and let's say people who are born in colonies who are descended from Europeans. For example, if you want to understand the what's called the Latin American Wars of Independence, the fact that, spoiler, most of Spain's colonies are overthrown in the early 1800s, those revolutionary movements are almost always led by Creoles. These are individuals like Mexico's first emperor, and only emperor actually, Agustin de Iturbide, Simon Bolivar of Venezuela and Colombia. These are people who are kind of given second-class citizenship, who are European in culture, they're European in background, but because they were born in the colonies, they can only climb up the social ladder so far until they hit that invisible glass ceiling. And by the way, this trend that I'm talking about in Spain's colonies, you could make an argument that we kind of see it with this guy. George Washington was kind of a British fanboy, thought the world of the British, and wanted nothing more than to join the British Army. But he was denied an officer's commission because he was a colonial. And because he was a colonial, there's an argument that could be made that this kind of is what started George Washington on the path to become commander of the Continental Army during the American Revolution. Now, can you hear me 3 a.m.? So this is a topic that we'll come back to time and time again during this course. So if you're playing me on 3 times speed, or at this point if you've dozed off, make sure to wake up. Let me make sure that I'm kind of awake as well. So obviously, because of the decline in the Native American population, the question is, what next for the Spanish and the Portuguese? And we've already mentioned that for them, the solution is the importation of slaves from West Africa. And if you also remember from yesterday, I said that slavery is omnipresent in history, right? Almost every society or civilization has employed forced or coerced labor in some way, shape, or form. But I also mentioned that the type of slavery that you see in North and South America is of a very different type than what you see in what we call the Old World. So again, if you take, for example, slavery in the Roman Empire, which is a subject that a fair number of people seem to know about. Just because you were a slave did not necessarily mean that you were considered a non-human, an unperson. You still had basic human rights, and in fact, many slaves, not all, at least had a reasonable expectation that they could be freed during their lifetime and maybe even obtain citizenship. Again, that might have been a pipe dream for some, but it still happened. And being a slave wasn't something that was held over your head the rest of your life after you were freed. And just to kind of give you an idea of what options were available to you during the Roman Empire. So at the low end, you would have slaves kind of working as agrarian laborers, right, as farmhands, more or less. But if you look at Caesar Augustus actually ran the Roman Empire to a certain extent using his own highly educated slaves. Most of them came from Greece. And, on the one hand, they were still slaves. They were still considered the property of Caesar Augustus, but they had a lot of power. I mean, they helped run the Roman Empire. So, for example, if one of Augustus's slaves was the guy who kind of ran personnel and got to decide which Roman general is going to, chill out in Rome and which Roman general is going to hang out in Scotland along Hadrian's Wall, Roman generals would have to be very careful not to offend that slave. So just because you were a slave didn't necessarily mean you were powerless. And again, it wasn't based on color. Usually slaves were slaves because in some cases they accumulated too much debt, or in some cases they were captured in war. But slavery wasn't tied to race or ethnicity, really. Chattel slavery, or what we call New World slavery, is different. And you can tell that by the name. I'm not sure if you've heard what a chattel is or heard that term, but if there are any future lawyers in here, you might want to take note of this, because in British and American law, a chattel, this word right here, that is a word that we use to refer to personal property. Okay, and personal property is basically just property that isn't land. Okay, so this coat, this is chattel, right? And if I get really angry and throw this coat, that was a weak sauce throw, but if I throw that coat to the other side of the room, well, theoretically, it's not going to be a big deal. It's a coat, right? It is an object. So think about what that means if we're starting to call slaves chattel. And hopefully, well, not hopefully, but I mean, if you're like me, your blood starts to run a little cold. Like, it's a creepy notion. But what we're basically saying is that human beings, people who are alive and thinking and breathing, are not actually human beings. They're property. And because they're property, there's no limitation to what treatment that property receives. So the assumption of chattel slavery is that a slave is property. The other thing that we kind of see is that slaves are really used just for one purpose, and that is they are agrarian laborers. Because hiring people to actually cultivate, in other words, harvest and tend cash crops, that's too expensive. And so what we have to do is we have to find people who can do the job but won't get paid for it, and can be forced to do the job if need be. And that's where chattel slavery comes in. It's not something where you see, you don't see chattel slaves, for example, in government or administration. Another sort of example, by the way, of how slaves in old world slavery could sometimes perform important jobs and tasks in the Ottoman Empire, for example. Basically, the Navy SEALs of the Ottoman Empire was an organization called the Janissaries. These were slave soldiers, but they helped run the Ottoman Empire. But with chattel slavery, you don't see slaves work in government or the military or anything except for agriculture. The other thing is that it's almost exclusively African. There was an attempt, by the way, to basically, in some cases, to basically impose chattel slavery on Native Americans. And we'll talk about this with some of England's colonies. But the problem is that Native Americans die out too quickly. Because of disease and because of the harsh labor conditions. And so African slaves are sort of selected for pretty obvious but still pretty heinous reasons. If you have mostly white settlers and mostly black Africans, if African slaves run away, they are easy to quickly identify. And so you don't have to necessarily go through and figure out the status of a particular slave because, spoiler, at this point, people don't have ID cards. And one of the things we'll talk about is that some contract laborers called indentured servants could just disappear if they wanted to. And they were really hard to track down. That wasn't the case with African slaves. And so what happens is that not only do you have the development of chattel slavery, but you also have the development of an idea that goes along with it. So this is where we can go ahead and mark the beginning of this idea of white supremacy, the belief that white people are inherently superior to other groups, non-whites. And it's kind of scary just how new this concept is. So I like talking about the Roman Empire today for some reason. So the Roman Empire was a European empire, but the Romans never really called themselves white people. The Roman Empire didn't really differentiate how it treated you based upon race. They might treat people from, for example, Germany different than they would treat people from France. But that wasn't because of race, that was because of nationality, of culture. But treating people differently because of observable physical differences, that's something that emerges specifically during this time period. And if you think about it, it's for reasons that are tied up with chattel slavery. A lot of people, you would hope most people, would find it difficult to really treat somebody else as a piece of property, like this person doesn't exist. Yeah, we might joke and say, yeah, I'm going to do that to my sibling. Yeah, you can do that for a day, but to permanently think of another human being as a non-person is something that I would hope most of us feel kind of a repugnance doing. And yet, the whole system of chattel slavery, of forcing people to perform labor that could kill them in sugarcane fields, in the Potosi mines of Bolivia, that requires some degree of coercion. And so the way slave masters come to terms with that is to say that, well, this group of people that are a different race, they're inferior. They're not really people. And maybe if we repeat that if we repeat that to ourselves over and over again, maybe that'll make it all right. And that's kind of the way chattel slavery works. It's a way for Europeans to kind of convince themselves that it's okay to make people perform backbreaking labor that could kill them on the basis that they're not really human anyway. So this is the beginning of chattel slavery, and along with it, the transatlantic slave trade. I should also point out that chattel slavery doesn't emerge overnight. And realistically, you don't see it necessarily in the Spanish Empire to the same degree as you see it in England's colonies and Portugal's colonies. Really, where you see chattel slavery on a wide scale in the New World is in Brazil. It was basically what happens is that the Portuguese create sugar plantations in Brazil, and they basically kill off their entire Native American workforce. And so they start importing African slaves. It was estimated that the mortality rate, in other words, the death rate among those African slaves was so high that the entire population had to be replaced every 10 years, which is just horrific to think about. But if the work didn't kill you, the journey would. Nearly 50% of slaves died on the passage over. When slave ships would basically journey from West Africa to North or South America along the Middle Passage, they were basically crammed into dark, crowded conditions. Where basically they were sitting in, blood, feces, vomit, disease, and they were shackled there for up to 4 to 8 weeks. I mean, and just think about. I mean, some of you might be thinking, "Man, I can't wait until he shuts up because I can get up and stretch my legs because they're falling asleep. I'm afraid that I'm dissolving away." Well, imagine what that's like for 4 to 8 weeks. And then once slaves would arrive in Brazil or on one of the sugar islands in the Caribbean, they would usually work 16 to 18 hours a day, 365 days a year. And the thing is that working in these tropical conditions where you usually see cash crop plantations emerge, let's just say that you don't usually find good sources of water. So very often the water is putrid or brackish, and there's a lot of mosquitoes, which isn't just uncomfortable, it's also a great way to get other types of disease like malaria. Um, the average lifespan of a slave that arrived in the Caribbean was about 7 years. Um, and if you think about that, it's incredibly expensive to bring slaves from West Africa all the way to the New World, and it's also expensive to replace them. But despite all of it, slavery was still seen as profitable. So only other thing to kind of mention about this is that slavery was so bad in the Caribbean, that the Caribbean especially, that if you look at the let's say the massive slave rebellions in colonial history, they almost always happen in the Caribbean. Because if you think about it, if you have an average life expectancy of 7 years, what have you got to lose? So that's what we're going to see over the next a couple of centuries, is this massive population transfer from West Africa to the New World. It's estimated that as many as 20 million people were brought from Africa to the New World in slavery. But if you look at basically the New World colonies from the year of Columbus's arrival, 1492, until roughly 1610, what you see is that it's really Spain and Portugal that are the only games in town. The other European powers, they've kind of explored North and South America, but they certainly haven't really colonized yet, at least not on a grand scale. I should point out that in 1585, England does decide to situate a colony in basically Roanoke, North Carolina, that I'd mentioned, but that colony disappears entirely, partially because the people who organized the colony thought that they could just depend upon Native Americans to feed them. And apparently the Native Americans took issue with that. So really what you see is that up until the year 1610, it's really Spanish and Portuguese colonization that dominates the New World, the Western Hemisphere. I'm going to go ahead and go over just a few things I want you to kind of know. So do know that even as late as the 18th century, so the 1700s, the goal is to find the Northwest Passage to Asia. There's still this desire to find some kind of navigable waterway to Asia. And this just kind of gives you a timeline, by the way, of the major events after 1492. You can kind of screenshot it, but I'll give you kind of a brief summary of each one. So Ponce de Leon and John Cabot were the first explorers to find the mainland coast of North America. Remember, Columbus finds basically the Caribbean islands. What he doesn't find is the main continent of North America. In 1794, you have the Treaty of Tordesillas, where basically Spain and Portugal agree to split the world between the two of them. Basically, Portugal claims Brazil and everything to the east of Brazil, so Portugal claims a lot of Africa and India, and Spain claims basically the rest of North and South America. So, by the way, that treaty is promptly ignored by everybody else who's not Spain and Portugal. But following that treaty, you have the conquest of Mexico by Hernan Cortés. And the fact that the Aztec Empire crumbles so quickly is a model to many Europeans of what can be accomplished if you have conquistadors and adventurers that are brave and willing enough. 1526, you see the beginning of the transatlantic slave trade. And in 1534, French explorer Jacques Cartier sails up the St. Lawrence River and proclaims New France in what is basically modern-day Quebec and Ontario. So in the 1530s, France actually starts to move towards expanding colonies into the New World. And then, of course, in 1565, we actually have the first real permanent settlement in what will eventually become the United States. We have the creation of the St. Augustine colony in Florida. But St. Augustine, I mean, you might think Florida, Disney World, warm beaches, what's not to like? But really, St. Augustine is just meant to be a military outpost to protect Spain's other more profitable colonial possessions. So that's the way things stand for now. We've gone over a lot of history in a little over an hour. And really, we've gone from 1492 all the way up to 1565. And this is kind of the high watermark, the apex of the Spanish Empire in the New World. And just think about this. When we meet again and talk about the efforts of England to establish a colony in the New World as well, the thing is that by the time England starts to create permanent colonies, Spain's empire in the New World is practically ancient. It's been around for almost a century, actually over a century, by the time England's first successful colony in Jamestown is established in 1607. And that's where we'll pick up next time. See you guys then.